Hi again. So last week we took a look at Mark chapter 1 and we saw how Jesus' popularity rose and rose. This week, beginning in chapters 2, we see something a little bit different. Chapter 2 starts with a passage, we're not going to read it, it's a little long, it's chapter 2 verses 1 to 12, but it's the story of Jesus teaching in a house. The whole city gathers to the door. It's now crowded. And 4 men come carrying their friend who is paralyzed. They can't get to Jesus, so they go on the roof of the house, open a hole, let their friend down through the roof of the house. Jesus sees him, receives him, and then says, "Your sins are forgiven." Now it's interesting. Jesus knew that they were looking for healing, not for forgiveness. And yet he said, "Your sins are forgiven." Now this is the center of this story, and it's what I wanted to talk about today. Now, Philip Richardson's class, the ministry and teaching of Jesus in the Synoptics, dealt with this very question just last week. Let's look at about a 2-minute clip. Philip has just asked the question, are there other ways in which someone can receive forgiveness of sin?
Well, the Old Testament indicated that you had to take a sacrifice in, and yet at that particular point in time, I don't think they were in the sacrificial system, so they would have to go to the priest, and they would have to forgive their sins. They'd have to atone somehow.
Yeah. So there was a sacrificial system in the temple. We read about this in the early books of the Bible, reading about the sacrifices that God instituted, bringing, for example, a lamb. We have different sacrifices for purification, for atonement. We have the Day of Atonement, once a year, talked about in Leviticus 16. So there were ways that individual sins could be forgiven through the sacrificial system in the temple, even in Jesus' day. But is Jesus a priest? Here again, I'm not thinking about Hebrews and its reflections on Jesus after the event spiritually, but was Jesus from the tribe of Levi? Was he a trained priest? I think you know why I'm asking that question. No, he wasn't. Jesus had no authority, if you like. You could go to the temple, you could do certain things, the priest could pronounce God's forgiveness, but Jesus is here pronouncing God's forgiveness. Your sins are forgiven. That is, your sins are forgiven by God, but he doesn't have the authority within the system to do that himself. And yet clearly Jesus does that with authority, and he does actually pronounce and bring forgiveness of sin. So that's something again else which sets Jesus apart as having a unique authority, something that tells us how Jesus saw himself, that he claimed this right to pronounce the forgiveness of sins.
That being true, we find out that what this passage is really about is the new way that Jesus is bringing forgiveness to God's followers. Now, instead of going to the temple to be forgiven, God walks among men and heals them and forgives them. This, of course, culminates in Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, where we now have forgiveness of the sin that we've committed. What about you? You know, in these days of isolation, we're doing things in new ways. What new way do you have today of reaching out to your neighbors, of reaching out to your family and friends? Tomorrow, we'll come back together and we'll talk about a new way in which Jesus now calls Levi and eats with tax collectors and sinners. We'll see you tomorrow.